Brink. Brink is a game with a certain reputation attached to it. Many people in the gaming sphere are perhaps more familiar with its infamy than they are with the game itself. That reputation is one of a game with high aspirations and effective marketing that fell far short of its goals and as a result disappointed a lot of people. To a certain extent that's all true, and that reputation isn't entirely undeserved, but I do think there are some things going on with Brink that are worth taking a look at. Developed by Splash Damage and published by Bethesda, Brink released in May 2011, but not after several delays. Brink can be considered something of an attempt at a breakout title for Splash Damage, who had previously worked on Wolfenstein Enemy Territory, a free multiplayer expansion for Return to Castle Wolfenstein, and later released Enemy Territory Quake Wars, which, unlike its predecessor, was a full-paid product acting as a prequel to the events of Quake 2. This previous work on the Enemy Territory games had brought them a reasonable amount of attention, and their experience with those games would have a lot of influence on Brink. The gameplay established in those titles would continue to serve as the framework for Brink's gameplay, with many elements such as the distinctive objective-based, narratively driven multiplayer once again being the core concept. But there was a sense in Brink's pre-release material that Splash Damage was aiming higher this time, and that they had lofty ambitions for Brink. They wanted it to become a new pillar of multiplayer gaming, and for it to reach a wider audience than they'd ever captured before. This ambition would, of course, prove to play part of Brink's downfall, as it is often considered to have failed to meet expectations set by its marketing and was unable to hold an audience for quite as long as its competitors. Brink was a fresh canvas for Splash Damage. While working on the esteemed Wolfenstein and Quake franchises was certainly a golden opportunity and built their brand, Brink instead allowed them to come up with their very own setting, and that setting is perhaps one of Brink's strong points. Brink takes place on the Ark, a city designed as a floating, futuristic, self-sustaining paradise for the rich and powerful. However, in the midst of global climate catastrophe, the Ark instead turned into a shelter for the displaced refugees that resulted from rising sea levels. Brink starts several decades after the first influx of those refugees, and the Ark is stretched to breaking point. All contact with the outside world has been lost. There hasn't been a new ship or plane seen for 20 years. Resources are drawing thin, and the separation between the refugee guests and the founders is growing wider. On the one hand, you have the resistance, who believe the founders live in luxury and are trying to maintain the status quo of a bygone era, and that they have no concern for the well-being of the guests, nor in trying to contact the outside world. Living segregated from the founders in squalor, with strict rationing and under constant security watch, resentment boils over into rebellion. Their primary goal under their leader Chen is to get help from the outside world, which they are convinced still exists. Negotiations with the founders failed, and so the resistance turns to increasingly violent methods. On the flip side is the Ark's security under Captain Mokoena, who believes that stringent enforcement of the founders' policies of conservation is key to survival, and that caving to resistance demands of searching for other survivors is only going to waste what little resources the Ark has left.
To survive, we must have order. We must save the Ark!
Brink doesn't present either of these factions as being the correct choice. Through mission intros, you get a feel for the kinds of people that make up these groups, and it becomes apparent that neither side is a monolithic entity, and that their soldiers may not always be in agreement with their superior, or even each other.
Hey, what's the matter?
My brother. He signed up with security. What if it's him in my sights?
Your brother should have known better than to side himself with those fascists.
My brother is no fascist!
Everyone in there made their choices.
Some are more headstrong, while others may have reservations about their missions. Some are revealed to have family members on the other side, and some become more entrenched and fanatical in their ideals as the campaign goes on.
By the time we get there...
But I have family there!
So do I, but we have a job to do here. Somebody fires at you, you put them down fast.
This is getting to us some stormtrooper BS.
Another neat little detail about these mission intros is that one side might not have complete information, or may even be lying about their intentions. Playing the same mission from the opposing side can offer greater context for the conflict. For instance, the security intro for the mission Container City claims that Chen is developing a biological weapon. However, in the Resistance mission intro, Chen instead claims that they're developing a vaccine to tackle an epidemic spreading through the guest slums.
There's a vaccine.
Of course, you think Chen doesn't have a plan B in case we can't get out of here.
If there's a vaccine, shouldn't we share it out?
Exactly! We will share it! But do you think we can trust the founders to distribute it fairly? Like the water rations?
But despite a good setting and a story with a surprising amount of nuance, there's some small issues with Brink's presentation that I think could have been improved upon. First, a lot of the world's backstory is tucked away in audio logs that you unlock by completing missions. The Ark's history and subtleties are almost exclusively found in these. Given the type of game Brink is, there's not a whole lot of room for exposition, so that decision was understandable and probably even the correct way to handle it. Despite that though, I'm not a big fan of info dump audio logs. I think one way of integrating that information into the game more fluidly would have been to have more banter between characters in mission, not just during the intros. As it stands, most of the in-game dialogue is gameplay-centric barks, stuff like ammo and health callouts, that sort of thing.
I've got a house for you. Impact deployed, huh?
When there's some downtime, such as lulls in action between objectives, it may have been nice to hear characters talk about life on the Ark and their thoughts on the situations they're in. Secondly, Brink does something very odd and frankly dumb with its campaign engine. So each faction has an outro movie that plays when you complete all of the missions in their campaign. Nothing very flashy or lengthy, just a small video with some epilogue voiceover. Well, for any given character you can only get one faction's actual epilogue. Whichever faction's campaign you complete first will give you the proper epilogue voiceover. The second campaign you complete, however, will have the cutscene but will always give a generic "Congratulations, you saw both sides of the conflict" voiceover. So, in order to get the correct voiceover for both campaigns, you have to create a new character and play the other campaign again. Now, it might not be a big deal. The epilogues are pretty bare bones and don't really offer anything terribly interesting. I just think it was a very odd choice, and I'd wager that it means very few players actually saw the proper versions of both epilogues. One area in which Brink's backstory does weave seamlessly into the game proper is the aesthetics of the levels. The distinction between the sections of the Ark that were built by the refugee guests and those that were part of the original construction is readily apparent. The rusted jumble of shipping containers and vessels used by the guests is contrasted by the stark white arcoral and sleek designs of the founders' areas. Arcoral being a form of genetically modified coral used in building the original Ark, which is as strong as steel and suitable for construction at sea. Through the environments you definitely get a feel for the kind of class divide at play, and it's further reinforced by the fact that the Founders Tower, a vast spire in the centre of the Ark, is visible from every map. With that tower looming over the slums, you can really understand the mindset of the guests living there. So, what about the visuals in general? Well, it's a mixed bag. Brink suffers from that 7th gen, washed out, grainy kind of look in the pursuit of grittiness. It's not quite to the extremes of the grey-brown colour palettes of many other games of its age. In fact, Brink can be quite colourful at times, but the filters and constant vignette don't do the game any favours, and I think it will look much better without them. Look, I'm very anti-vignette. I don't know why games ever have these as a permanent part of their visuals. Not a single video game player has ever said, yeah, this game looks okay, but what I really want is to feel like I have tunnel vision. Despite that, Brink's character models are very nice and I think they hold up pretty well. One of the most striking aspects of the game's visuals are the semi-stylized characters. Not quite to the point of being cartoony, but definitely exaggerated. Kind of like a realistic caricature, if that makes sense. Personally, I'm a fan of that, but I remember seeing a lot of "why the long face" jokes when Brink was new, so I think it might be a bit of a love it or hate it kind of thing. The style of Brink's characters also benefits from pretty robust customization options. For its time, Brink offered a lot of variety, and the two factions' aesthetic styles are distinct and work well as being complete opposites of one another. Brink's artistic integrity was also never sullied with ridiculous DLC outfits or outlandish additions with no regard for the original vision. All of the customization makes sense in-universe and is a cohesive package. I'm a big proponent of customizable characters, but only when the aesthetic style of the game is adhered to. With the advent of live service games especially, I think a strong distinct vision for a game's art direction and consideration for whether or not a cosmetic item actually fits the world is becoming a bit of a rarity. If Brink had released today, maybe that would be different, Maybe it'd have gaudy neon pink skins or outfits with sparkly animated textures, but as it stands, it manages to accomplish giving players a lot of freedom to personalise their character without going off the rails. However, given that Brink's customization was a big selling point, I think the game could have used a few more outfits per faction. Especially when you throw in the fact that some outfits have to be unlocked first, and by the time you get them, you're likely going to be done with the game. Admittedly, this is a bit of a nitpicky thing to take issue with perhaps, but again, it comes from a place of enthusiasm for character customization. So, the visuals have ups and downs, but what about the audio? Well, this is where it goes thoroughly downhill. Specifically, Brink has some of the worst audio mixing in a video game I've ever experienced, to the point that it can become genuinely detrimental to gameplay. The drop-off involved in sound effects is incredibly strange. Past a few meters, everything becomes barely audible. And I mean everything. Footsteps, gunshots, things that allow situationally aware players to gain auditory information can become near impossible to pick up. Take a listen here, for example.
The enemy's taking command post.
I take a bunch of hits and hear absolutely nothing. Yet the guy isn't all that far away and well within range of being able to hear his gunshots. Well, how about this grenade detonating with a whisper? Now, to give the benefit of the doubt, I think perhaps with the grenade they were going for the effect of having your character deafened by the blast. But if that's the case, then they should have had a suitably loud explosion first, followed by a ringing sound. Half-Life 2 did that exact thing and it works perfectly fine there.
Systems engaged.
Another oddity to add to this is that gunshots in general sound pretty weak when coming from allies and enemies. When you can even hear them, that is. But in first person, they can actually sound pretty decent. The shotgun sounds suitably beefy, and fast firing weapons such as the MP7 sound like they shred. So it's a shame the rest of the soundscape is so odd and lackluster. On the other hand, the voice acting is quite good. It's most notable in the pre-mission cutscenes, although it's not bad in-game either. But as mentioned earlier, a majority of it is relegated to situational combat barks. There's also a fair amount of different voice types you can choose from when creating a character too, so that's an extra layer of personalisation available to players.
No can do. There's only one of me. Enemy in disguise.
Musically, Brink isn't too notable in my opinion. What's there is serviceable, and while it's certainly not bad, it kinda just blends together. There aren't any standout pieces that really grab your attention. One thing I do like though is the music that plays while you're in a downed state. When you switch between the wait for a medic and respawn options, a piano note plays, and stringing them together plays the motif used in Brink's main theme. I think that's a cute little detail. So that's the presentation, but let's get into the meat of the game. As mentioned at the start of this video, Brink carries over a lot of the core gameplay from its enemy territory predecessors. Most notable of these carryovers is the way that Brink's primary game mode works. Rather than the simpler modes such as Team Deathmatch or Capture the Flag that most other online focused shooters centre around, Splash Damage opted for fluid, objective based gameplay with a narrative motivation. Each map contains its own set of objectives that the attacking team will progress through. This makes every map play in a slightly different manner, although typically these objectives will be from a pool of class-specific actions, such as soldiers planting a demolition charge, or operatives hacking a device. Additionally, there's side objectives to complete around the map. All maps feature capturable outposts that give team-wide buffs, as well as acting as forward supply points. Most, if not all, maps also feature shortcuts that can be opened by specific classes, using their same class-specific actions as the main objectives. In turn, these shortcuts can often be disabled by the defending team, and some maps also offer blockades that the defending team can enable in order to slow down and funnel attackers. I am a huge fan of this type of structured game mode, although unfortunately it's not too common to see in most shooters. Aside from Splash Damage's work, Unreal Tournament's Assault mode also comes to mind, and a little more recently, Battlefield 5's Grand Operations mode. I really like progressing through a map, and the added dynamics of being forced to fight in different areas as the match goes along also helps to keep things fresh. I also enjoy the immersion that the added in-universe context brings to the table. I'd much rather be placed in plausible scenarios with varied objectives than just have two teams plonked down in a static map with highly simplistic objectives like Team Deathmatch. In pre-release interviews and previews, Splash Damage made a point to bring up the way that their campaign is structured. They frequently talked about the ability to play any way you like, single player, co-op, PvP, and have it all be one cohesive player experience, and that you would gain character progression no matter what. And yeah, that's technically true, but at the end of the day, Brink is designed as a multiplayer PvP game first and foremost. You can play single player and co-op, but the reality is that it's simply a bog standard bot match. I've got a lot to say about those bots, but before I descend into that rant, let's first look at some of the other main elements of Brink's moment-to-moment gameplay, starting with the much hyped parkour abilities. One of Brink's major components and a focal point of its marketing was the smooth movement across random terrain, or SMART system. The concept behind this system being that a player's movement should never be totally halted by small obstacles. In gameplay terms, this translates to parkour moves being seamlessly integrated into a player's movement, with minimal need for player input. So this means that while sprinting, you'll automatically vault, mantle and slide over or under obstacles in your way. The extent of your movement abilities depends on your selected body type, with heavy bodies only being able to cross waist-high objects but having the most health and access to the heaviest guns, medium bodies able to cross head-high objects while being middle of the road in terms of health and armaments, and light bodies having a full range of movement, including wall hopping and ledge grabbing, but being physically weak and only able to use the lightest weapons. Again, this is a feature that Splash Damage loved to flaunt, but it turned out to be something quite mediocre. In practice it does work, but I think more people were expecting Mirror's Edge levels of fluidity and speed. A sentiment not helped by the flashy CGI trailer that made it look like Brink's parkour was going to be faster and more freeform, but it just isn't that. Even with the lightest body type, it feels a lot clunkier than Mirror's Edge, and the semi-automated nature of it means that you'll occasionally get into situations where you're wrestling with the system to actually do what you intend to do. That's not to say the parkour is never useful though. The light body type does have access to more shortcuts and flanking routes due to its enhanced movement capabilities. So it isn't a total gimmick, although admittedly its usefulness does vary from map to map. In what was perhaps a slight misstep, the light body type is also not unlocked at the start of the game. While it doesn't take long to acquire, the decision to level gate it means that most of the parkour that played a big part in the marketing of the game is unavailable to the players for a good few missions. Curiously though, I think it's worth pointing out that Brink brought enhanced mobility to the table before it really caught on in multiplayer shooters. These days, plenty of shooters feature a lot of the same mobility that Brink did. Battlefield, Call of Duty, and Halo, to name a few, all incorporate similar obstacle navigation capabilities to what Brink was doing a whole decade prior. While I think it'd be a bit of a stretch to say that Brink had any direct influence on these games, I do find it interesting that it was sort of a collective realisation that mobility options in multiplayer shooters are a good idea. And in that regard, I think it's fair to say that Brink was ahead of the curve. Brink's core gameplay is that of a class-based shooter. There are 4 classes: Soldier, Medic, Engineer and Operative. The Soldier can resupply ammo, set C4 charges on objectives, and primarily has damage and explosive focused abilities and perks. The Medic is pretty self-explanatory. They heal, they buff allies' health, and they revive teammates. The Engineer, again, is pretty self-explanatory. They repair objectives, they buff teammates' damage, and they set mines and turrets. And finally, the Operative is basically an equivalent to the Team Fortress Spy. They can interact with dead enemies to disguise as them and have disruption and trap abilities. They're also the class required for hacking objectives. Rather than giving a linear path of progression for unlocking class abilities and perks, Brink instead opts for a more freeform system. As you play and level up, you earn special credits which can be spent on abilities and perks for specific classes, as well as some generic ones that apply to any class. In theory, that's not such a bad idea. It lets players focus on what they like to play and progress towards making their particular playstyle more effective. However, in practice, it means you'll most likely have a class or two that are underinvested in and thus weaker. Considering that Brink is a game where the objective changes frequently and thus in turn you'll frequently be changing class to adapt, this means that half the time your class abilities will be somewhat underpowered. Another consequence of this type of progression is that there are some abilities that are pretty much essential to pick, and then there's others that are basically a waste of ability credits. If the progression was flat like most other class-based shooters, there would never be a risk of wasting valuable unlock credits on useless abilities, and players' classes will all be improving over the course of gameplay rather than just one or two classes permanently being much stronger than the rest. I can see what they were going for with the decision. The idea is obviously to let players focus on what they want to improve and what abilities they consider to be the priority for them. But again, given that playing just one class is not really how Brink is designed, I think it ends up being a little counterintuitive for the actual gameplay. The freeform element of class loadouts doesn't end there though, as Brink's classes are also not restricted in their weapon choices. Any class can use any weapon, provided the right body type is also equipped. In class-based games with no weapon restrictions, the risk is always that certain pairings will dominate, or that it creates a type of gameplay that is fundamentally at odds with the idea that classes all have to work together, instead giving individual players the power to essentially circumvent the class-based design. For example, combining the ability to use sniper rifles with the ability to endlessly resupply your own ammo is just encouraging lone wolf gameplay that isn't helpful to the objective. I never really found this to be an issue in Brink, however, although playing in single player means that I avoided that kind of thing entirely. One thing I can say for certain is that Brink is not a game in which sitting back and sniping is even really viable, since a majority of the combat takes place at very close range. Plus there's the fact that every ability uses supply points, meaning spamming self-healing as a medic, for example, is not guaranteed invincibility, since you'll run out supply pretty quickly. The weapons themselves are fairly typical of shooters. Most of them do feel decent balance-wise, although I found that most of the handguns were just too weak once health buffs and armour start coming into play. Most of the weapons can also be customised, which again is fairly typical. You've got red dot sights, foregrips, magazines and so on. Sights and muzzle brakes have a few cosmetic variations to choose from, which is another thing that would later become common in multiplayer shooters. Although again, I think Brink's influence on that is incredibly unlikely. One really neat touch about the different muzzle brake options is that all of them actually affect the shape of the flash, resulting in each brake having a unique flash pattern. I can't think of a single other game that has done this. Even Call of Duty's recent installments with their 600 muzzle attachments haven't bothered with this detail. Actually unlocking new weapons and attachments is done in a bit of an atypical manner. Rather than unlocking them through leveling up your character or killing certain amounts of enemies with a given weapon or anything like that, weapons and attachments are instead unlocked through special challenge maps. The challenges are an objective completion time trial, a parkour race, tower defense, and an escort mission. They're not very difficult, but they're also not very fun. You also have to complete all of them twice over to fully unlock everything, with the difficulty ramping up between runs. The first goal would be for 1 star, which unlocks a handful of items, and the second will be for 2 stars, which unlock the rest of the challenge's rewards. Any attempt after that will be on 3 stars, but that doesn't give you any additional unlocks and simply puts your time and score on a leaderboard. One positive about this system is that once you unlock everything, it's permanent, even across characters. So if you're like me and didn't really get much enjoyment out of these challenges, you only ever need to do them twice each. Thankfully, they're also very short too.
The wall-mounted indicator device.
Unfortunately though, Brink's actual gunplay is kind of mediocre. Part of it is definitely that Brink relies on bloom more than actual recoil of weapons, and bullet spread seems to be entirely random. That can lead to some actual frustration, where your aim is true, but the game just decides that your bullets came out at a 45-degree angle. But on top of that, there's also something lacking on a more visceral level, a certain lack of impact. And to be completely honest, I can't really put my finger on why that is exactly. Brink does have visual cues for bullets hitting enemies in the form of blood spray, and characters do have a flinch animation when hit. Yet, filling an enemy with lead just feels so puny still. I think perhaps the visual feedback from the weapon animations themselves is also a factor. Firing a gun has weak visual recoil. Again, Brink features more bloom than actual recoil. And guns generally have a weightless feel to their animations. So I think that sort of comes together to form a very bland blend. Okay, enough stalling. It's time to talk about the AI. For this review, I was forced to play solo. Brink does support user-hosted servers, so it's not at the mercy of splash damage completely pulling the plug, but Brink's player population barely lasted longer than a fart, so good luck finding a server that's actually populated in 2023. At the time of recording, I couldn't find any servers at all, let alone populated ones, and so I was saddled with the colossal ineptitude of Brink's CPU teammates and opponents. Brink's AI does the absolute bare minimum required of it, and sometimes not even that. It rarely utilises the tools at its disposal, and when it does, it uses them poorly. Perhaps most notable is the fact that the AI makes infrequent use of the smart system, and more often than not, bots using the light body type will just charge in the front door with everybody else, rather than using its mobility to flank or access any of the shortcuts available. And it's not even a case of the bots being entirely unable to utilise this feature either, because in rare instances, they can be seen doing parkour, so I guess it's just a case of them not being programmed to actually make use of it in any meaningful way. Another example is when a bot plays the operative class. Rarely will the bots use that class's ability to disguise as an enemy, and when one actually does disguise, it will typically stand around completely inactive afterwards. Or how about medics just running up to you and staring blankly instead of reviving? Now, I think this one might actually be tied to revives costing supply points, and in these instances I suspect the AI has run out of supply, but it still attempts to revive. But if that is the case, then the AI shouldn't attempt to revive at all if it has run out of supply, because it will just remain inactive and fixated on a downed ally until it inevitably gets itself killed. Furthermore, Brink's AI seems to be absolutely terrible at prioritising objectives. Frequently they will put capturing command posts or engaging in sub-objectives above the main goal. Considering that command posts can change hands frequently and shortcuts can often be easily closed again, this means in some missions your AI teammates will essentially be chasing their own tail the entire time, rather than doing anything productive. Hacking objectives in particular are just torturous to play solo. The AI seems to have a complete and utter aversion to this objective type. They're very timid when it comes to planting a hack box, and if you take the initiative, they will take forever to actually start hacking with you. Then there's the fact that this is one of the few objective types that can have its progress completely undone by the defending team, which means you have to more or less complete this entire objective by yourself from start to finish and defend it the entire time. But it doesn't end there. On top of these issues, in some maps, it's not out of the ordinary to find entire teams of bots just clumped up in a corner somewhere, staring at a wall or something. All of these issues piled on top of each other add up to bots that are legitimately infuriating to play with or against. There is just so much about them that is broken or undercooked, and playing single player you'll find yourself pulling the entire weight of the team at every moment. These players may be artificial, but they sure ain't intelligent. Okay, before I move on, I just want to point out this Easter egg I noticed. In a few spots in the game, you can find this graffiti of a little guy chomping on a fish with the words, "We eat cod," in what I can only assume is a pun taking aim at Call of Duty. Looking at this in 2023 is pretty embarrassing. Hell, even in 2011 this would have been embarrassing. Better games than Brink have tried and failed to dethrone Call of Duty's position. It just has some real Battleborn, come at me bro vibes. Brink was ultimately met with middling reviews and failed to grasp an audience for very long. Despite that though, it was allegedly a commercial success. According to Splash Damage co-founder and then CEO Paul Wedgwood, Brink sold an estimated 2.5 million units, translating to around $120 to $140 million by his count. Brink would receive one single piece of major DLC, available to players free of charge for a limited window, which included 2 new maps, some new class abilities, and a couple of cosmetic sets. But that would be the entire extent of Brink's post-launch content. If Brink was as much of a financial success as claimed, Splash Damage and Bethesda seemed unwilling to try squeezing it for even more money, perhaps seeing the writing on the wall with its poor audience reception. Eventually, after years of inactivity, Brink was made totally free to play in 2017, with the exception of the aforementioned downloadable content. In the wake of Brink's release, Splash Damage would veer off into other ventures with War Chest, a publishing arm focusing on free-to-play games, and Fireteam, a business focused on back-end technology for multiplayer games. In this time, Splash Damage kept a lower profile, releasing some mobile games in tandem with the previously mentioned side businesses and working on the multiplayer component to Batman Arkham Origins. Fast forward to 2015 and the arrival of Dirty Bomb, a free-to-play spiritual successor to Brink. A spiritual successor to a spiritual successor, if you will. Personally, Dirty Bomb didn't really resonate with me as much as Brink. It leaned more into the hero shooter genre, as was the style at the time, with preset characters and special abilities with stricter loadouts, as well as the free-to-playness of it locking heroes behind the grind unless you coughed up some cash. Plus, I just found the setting and style to be far duller and less memorable than Brink's. Dirty Bomb did manage to maintain a player base for a bit longer than Brink, but would ultimately have support dropped in 2018. Despite that, it does remain playable much like Brink does, and unlike Brink, has a small but dedicated fanbase. Apart from that, Splash Damage has mostly acted in support of other studios, leveraging their expertise with multiplayer shooters. One notable exception to this, however, is Gears Tactics, which they developed in collaboration with the Coalition. I've only played a little bit of Gears Tactics, but from what I saw, it was a competent XCOM-like with some good presentation and execution, so maybe one day I'll do a video on that game too. So it looks like Brink as a franchise is likely done. Finished at the starting line, as it were. I think it goes without saying that it obviously didn't succeed in becoming that breakout title that Splash Damage was hoping for. At least not in terms of popularity. But Brink hasn't completely faded from memory, if only due to its notoriety. Even the idea of a sequel does endure as something of a meme. It's not uncommon to see Brink 2 mentioned as a joke among gamers, or to see it listed in faked leaked lineups for game reveal events. For whatever reason, I remember enjoying Brink when it first released. I couldn't quite understand why it was getting such a negative rap. Upon revisiting it for this review, however, I began to see exactly why. And to be honest, it almost made me a little bit sad. In the bluntest terms, Brink is not a good game. Its gameplay ranges from functional and unremarkable to broken and frustrating. So now I think I can see what everyone else saw at the time. That said, it isn't the absolute worst game out there either, contrary to what some would have you believe. It does have some positives to be found, primarily in the setting and style, as well as the solid core framework inherited from its enemy territory predecessors. Plus, I think Brink certainly had some good ideas squirreled away in there, ideas that would independently resurface in other, more popular games several years later. I also think that I likely would have had a marginally better time with the game had the multiplayer still been populated. Those issues with the AI alone were a good chunk of the frustrations that I experienced with the game. But unfortunately, that's going to be the only way a majority of people can experience the game anymore, and as a consequence, those issues are massive. Going back to the idea of a sequel for a minute, Brink 2 is actually something that I personally would like to see. Brink may have been a bit of a dud, but I think the setting and ideas are worth exploring again. There's a lot that could be improved upon and mechanics that could be tightened up, and give it a modern coat of paint with some wrinkles smoothed out. Yeah, I think there could be a genuinely good game in there somewhere. Although, realistically, what would a Brink 2 actually look like in today's gaming landscape? Unfortunately, I think the most likely answer would be free to play and driven by microtransactions. But let's not dwell on a hypothetical like that. Now, you might think that I'd be hesitant to recommend Brink at all, but the fact that Brink is now free makes it difficult not to recommend, even with the negatives. If only as a throwaway 30-minute curiosity. Although putting it that way makes it sound more like going to the freak show to chuck peanuts at the Elephant Man than, playing a game. At any rate, I'd encourage people to check it out for themselves. And if you're part of a gaming community, maybe you could get some others to play with you and hopefully have a better time playing it with actual humans like it was intended to be. And with that, Brink has been Brunk. Thanks for watching.